It occurs to me that in the descriptor of this sermon, it says that I'm going to offer a rebuttal to the stereotype and cliche in Unitarian Universalism that if you're a UU, you can believe anything you want. I didn't get there in this sermon, which so often happens to me. So that'll have to be another sermon for another day. But I think that I would just say to make note of that there are things that are not in keeping with our principles and our sources and our values as Unitarian Universalists. And as you listen to this sermon and you think about some of those sources, maybe you can think about some of those things that are not in keeping with these sources and our principles. And someday I will write a sermon that is actually about that. But not today. Today is not that day. Unitarian Universalism is described by our association as a living tradition, which means that while we are rooted in our history, our religious movement is an ever-evolving, shifting institution meant to respond to the needs of the moment. Our words and actions as Unitarian Universalists are informed by our principles and the sources from which we draw our inspiration and our calls to action. The phrase, "we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us," was made famous by Sir Isaac Newton. And the phrase is one we often refer to. We hold sacred our long history, believing in our responsibility to carry our movement forward in honor and respect to those who came before us. Because we are a living tradition, our national bylaws include a requirement that we study our principles, sources, and purposes at least every 15 years. The evolution of our principles and sources can be traced throughout our history, beginning with our merger in the 60s, though there were principles and sources in Unitarianism and Universalism before that. But the most significant shift after our merger occurred in 1986, when a group of women, frustrated by the lack of female representation and overwhelming Christian privilege, proposed changes adopted at our yearly assembly. These principles and sources have continued to receive updates and have seen proposed changes in the years since 1986. The sixth source, naming Earth-centered traditions, was added in 1995. And in 2017, the second source was updated from the wording of words and deeds of prophetic women and men to words and deeds of prophetic people. Our ability to shift our language to meet the moment and expand our awareness of the diversity within our faith as we consider our sources speaks to the aliveness of Unitarian Universalism. I've often said, because I believe it so firmly, that Unitarian Universalism can change the world. By drawing deeply from the sources that call us towards our higher selves, we have the collective capacity to speak truth to power and to dismantle the forces that threaten the thriving of humanity. At the present moment, we are a nation under siege, plagued by gun violence, rampant sexism, homophobia and transphobia, poverty, and ever worsening climate change. We are called as UUs to resist oligarchies, to protect the vulnerable, and to stubbornly believe in our ability to bring forth a better world. During this time when spiritual healing and mystic inspiration can feel distant and unattainable, we are called to draw ourselves more deeply into the sources that guide us and to strain to hear the voice of the divine guiding us along the path. For this reason, it is imperative that we learn about the sources that inspire our faith and to hold them in our consciousness with the same persistent awareness that we hold our principles. Our first source is our individual direct experience of transcendence and wonder. Essentially, this refers to those experiences which connect us to something larger than ourselves. For some of us, those experiences occur in nature when we take in the world around us and recognize the undeniable fact of our interdependence. For others, experiences of transcendence are literally spiritual in that we become connected to a sense of the divine force. Often these experiences are described as an overwhelming sense of love and acceptance of yourself and of humanity that seems to come directly from the oneness of the universe. And for many of us, those who don't believe in such experiences and those who desperately desire them and yet don't or have not yet received them, these experiences elude us. In my women's group, we were recently lamenting of our own desire for some sort of transformative spiritual experience, something that would assure us that our sense of God in our lives was very real indeed, an experience that would offer us the healing we desire in our hearts, bodies, and souls. But still, we wait. For those who so desire such experiences, our hope can be found in the experiences of others. Our second source concerns the words and deeds of prophets like Groucho Marx. All those who have spoken truth to power in our modern era and the eras of our ancestors. There are certainly Unitarian Universalist prophets. Saint Servetus, perhaps being the first, the 16th century Spanish scientist and theologian who was burned at the stake by Calvinists for preaching against the Trinity. And we have our modern prophets, particularly those who have faced ostracism or criticism within the denomination for attempting to dismantle our own white supremacist enculturation. The 2020 UUA report, Widening the Circle of Concern, examines the historical insidiousness of racism in a denomination populated by well-meaning liberal white folks. And its contents continue to offer us a path forward towards a more inclusive, liberative faith. I know that often institutional reports are dry and full of statistics and other boring things, but if you have not read Widening the Circle of Concern, I highly recommend that you look it up because it's actually full of really great stuff and it offers a really important lens into our denomination. So there are voices of prophets in our modern collective. And of course, we have our own personal prophets also, if you are willing to listen to them. Consider those in your life who have offered you a word of truth, be it educators pointing you in the direction of your passions, or friends reaching out in concern of your well-being, or even a passing stranger who makes a remark too spot on to ignore. Any person demonstrating bravery in the face of the powers that be, or who demonstrates compassion in a world in sore need of it, or who draws you closer to the ethic of love we are called to live, is a prophet, according to our sources. Wisdom from the world's religions is our third source, as well as their lessons of spirituality and ethics. UUs are proudly multi-theist, encouraging members to seek out and to draw from sources that speak to their spirits. It's why so many of us are Buddhist or pagan and can practice those aspects of our spiritual life without fear of ostracism or judgment within our congregations. The line we straddle comes in appropriation as we learn to recognize what does and what does not belong to us. An example that's come up most recently in my own Wiccan practice could be certain kinds of sage smudging, often used by white pagan and Wiccan practitioners, which has been deemed a closed practice by indigenous Americans. And a closed practice means that it belongs only to that culture of people. And these indigenous folks are aiming to protect their own spiritual practices from being misinterpreted or misunderstood by perhaps well-intentioned white folks, while also attempting to protect native plants that have been over-harvested by eager non-indigenous folks. If you go to like a TJ Maxx or the Five Below store and they sell sage smudging sticks, don't buy them. Don't buy them. If you are in a chain store that is selling sage, it is very likely an over-harvested plant that indigenous folks are desperately trying to protect. Don't buy them. There are other things that you can burn, and there's lots of stuff on Google and the World Wide Web that can lead you towards some more sustainable, ethical forms of smudging and smoke burning. UUs tend to let their enthusiasm override their sensitivity on occasion. Ugh. And I'm pleased by recent messages from the UUA encouraging ministers to examine if our own congregations may be guilty of claiming something that isn't ours. We will never celebrate Dios de los Muertos. See, I can't even say it because I'm a white person who doesn't speak Spanish. I have no business celebrating that holiday. We won't do it here. It's not ours. Someone who does come from that culture becomes a part of this UU congregation and wants to share it with us. That's a different thing. And yet, our multi-theism recognizes that spiritual wisdom does not belong to one particular group, but to all of humanity. Human beings are spiritual creatures who have spent millennia since the cavemen, like Sanders said, attempting to understand and pay homage to what we consider sacred. As Unitarian Universalists, the whole of humanity's spiritual interpretations are available to inform our intellect and expand our hearts. The last three sources concern our Christian and Jewish heritage, science and humanism, and earth-centered spirituality. The multi-theism, which includes non-theism for those atheists who are present, is perhaps the most special aspect of our religion. The search for truth and meaning is not attached to dogma, fear, or threats of assimilation. Reason and science are just as sacred as spirituality and theology. Unitarians and Universalists both have undeniably Christian roots, and we discredit ourselves when we abandon that history. Unitarianism and Universalism has persisted against the odds for hundreds of years, and we are the legacy of theologians and prophets who were willing to risk their homes and their lives to defend what they believed, whether it was that Jesus Christ was only man and not God, or the radical idea that the whole of humanity was deserving of God's mercy and salvation. Many modern UUs, if they were not fortunate enough to be born into the faith, are refugees of other religions that have done harm to them. I myself left my Christian denomination after experiencing religious trauma, but letting go of the faith that raised me does not mean I need to ignore the roots of the faith I found. Indeed, I find it inspiring and encouraging to know that much of the theology I wrestled with as a young person was the very theology our UU ancestors were wrestling with so long ago. It's been a pastoral tenet of mine that spiritual healing allows us to separate out the sins of the religious communities that hurt us from the theologies we once held sacred. In my own healing as a UU, I've found my way back to the bits of religion that once moved and formed me. God's enduring steadfastness for one, the sacred power of community for another. Our source of humanism and science warns us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. In his sermon, Idolatries of the Mind and Spirit, Reverend Bill Sinkford posits that such a warning was meant to protect humanism from becoming reliant on creeds and dogmas based on faith rather than science. James Luther Adams was a great Unitarian ethicist of the late 20th century, and he wrote, "Idolatry occurs when a social movement adopts as the center of loyalty an idol, a segment of reality torn away from the context of universality, an inflated, misplaced abstraction made into an absolute." Reverend Sinkford writes, "Idolatry is the worship of false gods or partial gods. Partial truth creates boundaries, sets up hierarchies, and justifies violence. It is not hard to lose balance. So many experiments and so much of history tells us that we have the capacity for violence, each of us. We deplore the hate-filled rhetoric of our current national politics, but are we surprised that racism still thrives? Are you? Is it any surprise that our systems work to keep the powerful in power? When we begin to understand the dangers of idolatry, Sinkford seems to suggest, we develop greater awareness of our own propensity towards it. The sixth source is the most recent, added in 95, Spiritual Teachings of Earth-Centered Traditions, which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. The mid-90s witnessed a kind of resurgence of earth-centered spirituality, and pagan and Wiccan UUs were becoming a prominent faction of Unitarian Universalism. The sacred circles of life and the rhythms of nature are mentioned, asserting our religion as one interested in and committed to the preservation of the natural world, in opposition to the forces of economy and government hell-bent on sucking up and capitalizing on all of Earth's resources. Unitarian Universalism holds our Christian and Jewish heritage, the reason of humanism and science, and the sacredness of earth-centered spirituality as equally informative for our faith. This nod to the legitimacy of various sources of inspiration is something we, as UUs, can be proud of and should be protective of. We are the church of the open mind and the open heart, and a continued drawing from our sources will ensure that we stay that way. At this point in our collective history, it is woefully easy to fall to despair. There is so much evil and violence in the world and so many reasons to be hopeless. But humans are remarkably resilient, stubborn and willful even. It is during times like these that we are called to ground ourselves even more deeply in our traditions, in the guidance of our principles, and in the nourishment of our sources. I encourage you, if you are feeling adrift or unsure where to turn, to refamiliarize yourself with our principles and to draw intentionally from our 6 sources. This reinvigorated focus may offer your worried heart a bit of reassurance that ultimately, with care and attention, everything can be okay. And remember, we are more powerful collectively than we can ever hope to be alone. Let's ground ourselves in what we know to be true and orient our gaze toward a better tomorrow for the sake of those who came before us. May it be so because we make it so. Amen and blessed be.